This is the Coaching Leader Podcast, a podcast about coaching, leadership, and leading through coaching. And here's your host, Scott Gress.
Hi, and welcome to the Coaching Leader Podcast. Today, we're pleased to welcome a pastor, a church planter, a denominational executive, a leadership coach. We like that. Author of 10 books, numerous articles and speaking engagements and blogs and podcasts, and the senior fellow for the Leadership Network. Welcome to the podcast, Reggie McNeal.
Hey, thanks, Scott. It's good to be here. And that's senile fellow, I think, with Leadership Network. But don't tell them. I mean, right. they just printed the wrong word there.
Gotcha. So, did I catch everything in the bio, or there's probably a million other things?
Oh no, no, you got. I sent you that fake bio, and you pulled out the most important fake news pieces. So good for you.
Well, I first got familiar with you when somebody handed me a Revolution in Leadership way, a number of years ago.
Another life, yeah.
Yeah, and found out that you were working with the Missouri Synod on something called DLM, Developing Leaders for Ministry, and got familiar with your work. What do you remember from back then?
I remember that was a fun group to be with. You guys were kind of rogue is not the right word, but you were willing to lend an ear to someone outside your tribe, and think around the edges of some stuff. So I found that group of pastors was probably more entrepreneurial, certainly much more missionally inclined, and more in touch with the culture, as opposed to just being bubbled off. You were asking really good questions about how do we connect with this culture, this new world that has developed in our very own lifetimes.
Yeah, even back then, you were very strong and clear about where's God at work. It's not just in the building. It's not just on your property. And the idea of joining him and figuring that out and meeting people where God's Spirit was at work, and really was encouraging, but also challenging at the same time.
Well, thanks. The conversation, all I've ever wanted to do, and really my prayer has been, I just hoped I could help shape the conversation in church leaders and in different tribes in different ways. That's happened. But I gosh, Scott, way back then when you and I were together, and that, I would speak at a conference and I'd get hate email by the time I got to the airport, about, because we were having to do a fair amount of deconstruction just to clear the way for some realignment and with God's mission, and that was unsettling to a bunch of folks. But I'm grateful because I've lived long enough now to see some of this conversation come around, and maybe it's because people know what they're getting when I go now, but it's not exactly a surprise what I'm going to talk about. But I also think there's been among folks that really are missionally attenuated. I think there's a much greater and still growing awareness that we've got to do, that business as usual churchianity is not getting it done, and it's not going to get it done.
Yeah, and the things that you've been writing about and speaking about and talking about is such a challenge because it gets to our basic assumptions of how we do what we do, and it just gets in the way of our default mode of just operating as church leaders. One of your recent books here, Kingdom Come.
Oh, I haven't read that one yet.
It's good.
It's on my nightstand. I'm going to get to it this year, I think.
But talks about that shift from, church-centric to kingdom-centric. What is that all about? Could you just kind of give us a thumbnail sketch there or more?
Sure. Well, and words help and or get in the way. And so I've looked a long time for ways of saying this so that people can grab hold of what I'm trying to talk about fairly quickly. And I've landed on church-centric, kingdom-centric as kind of a vis-a-vis position to describe one of church as institution and the commitment we have there, and the fact that we've inherited church as institution as the primary expression of church in the Western culture now, North America for sure, but really everywhere the Western footprint went down. We have a congregational modality, and no matter what kind of denominational structure or whatever else, and particularly since the Reformation, we've been trying to fix the church and get it right, and with the assumption then that the whole world will pay attention. And of course, you Lutherans have been working on the Reformation for 500 years now, and so I'm assuming you're getting close to wrapping this sucker up. But right, maybe. So I'm just waiting, and then you let me know when y'all put the final deal. But the truth of the matter is, in this new world, it's not a church-centric approach, church as institution, that's going to make the difference. We've got to move to a church as movement perspective. But I really want to use a biblical word for that, and that word is kingdom, because the kingdom of God is a movement. It also is God's major mission. I mean, I grew up thinking that the church, in a church-centric thinking, that God taught us to, Jesus would teach us to pray, "Thy church come," and that his biggest concern, his visit to the planet, was to establish the church, and that's on God's mind every day. When the truth of and I'm sure it is, but the truth of the matter is, God's kingdom is the biggest story, and the church is a part of that story. But we don't. It's bigger than us. And we're not the point. The kingdom is the point. And Jesus created a church to get people to the kingdom, not the other way around. I mean, the kingdom is not a subset of church activity. The church is a subset of kingdom activity.
Yeah.
And God's major mission on planet Earth has been and will be his kingdom, and that survives into eternity. Because, as long as you have God, you have a kingdom, because those go together. But the church is folded into that. I mean, we have a definite beginning and a definite end. We're not the fourth member of the Trinity, and we're not eternal. That we have a role to play in space and time. And when we don't get that role right, if we think we're the point, then we become problematic. So
when you say kingdom of God, what do you mean by that? How would you define that?
Thank you. Certainly, Jesus, and there are people who talk about the kingdom of God in ways that use earthly kingdoms, and then try to retrofit. Jesus was pretty plain. My kingdom's not of this world, and I think starting with human kingdoms and working our way is the wrong path to get to the truth of it. I just try to really look at what I characterize the kingdom, I should say, because I can't define it. You define something, in the kingdom is so, I mean, how many different parables did Jesus use to try to help us understand the kingdom? If it were simple, but I think the point of the kingdom is life. And, but with the important caveat, life as God intends. I mean, this is why Jesus said, "I've come to give you life." And the Bible starts in a garden with a tree of life in the middle. That's not accidental, and God sends angels to guard that when Eden disintegrates. We in the book, in the city of God with a river of life and trees of life, and Jesus comes in, and he life is God's precious gift that he doesn't rescind. I remember my youngest granddaughter, when they handed her to me in the hospital, my immediate thought was, I'm holding a creature who will never cease to exist. That's the power of life, and how important it is. I think it was C.S. Lewis, right, that said, well, you've never dealt with a mere mortal. Human beings are created in the image of God, which by definition, or by grace, or however you say it, includes that eternal spark of life that's in us. And so God had a dream for every human being, has a dream for every human being, the life that he intends for them to have. And Jesus, that's why he says, I've come to give you that. In case we missed it, he backed up and said, and it's abundant, and it's an abundant life. And then he makes the most astonishing claim when he says, I am the life. So, Jesus came to live the kingdom life in front of us to show us exactly the kind of life God had in mind for us. It's not just, he didn't just come, to do the work on the cross and all that kinds of, his entire life, his teaching, but how he dealt with people, the way he expressed himself. All of that was to live in front of us the kingdom life, and you and I. So Jesus sits down and he feeds 5,000 people from a lunchbox. We're supposed to be abundant thinkers, not what do we not have here, but what do we have here to work with? We're supposed to be healers. We're supposed to be people of peace. We're supposed to be, above everything, people of hope. So Peter tells us to be ready to give an answer for the hope that's in us. Kingdom is hope, because it says, in fact, I ask people, and I'll quit and let you get back in this conversation. I don't know why you think you should be running this thing, but I ask people a lot of times, what are your hopes? What are your dreams? And then I ask them, where do you think that comes from? And because I think our hopes and dreams for our life are echoes of the kingdom. We believe that things should be better than they are. Well, where does that idea come from? If we just crawled out of the primordial ooze, I don't think we would imagine something beyond us like that. So I think that's kind of God's homing device in us that says, I'm pulling you toward a preferred future, and that kingdom is what that is.
Well, you're causing so many things to pop in my brain. Recently, I was preaching at a church as a guest preacher, and I noticed there was all kinds of law offices and bail bondsmen, places up and down the street next to the church. And I happened to think to myself and say out loud, those people who go in and out of those places are not having a good day.
Yeah.
But you have the good news.
Yes. And what's interesting to me, Scott, is I grew up in a tradition, as you well know, evangelical tradition, that was so concerned about getting people to heaven, that if we could just get them to pray the prayer or whatever, they're good to go.
Yeah.
And it seems to me, the more and I'm a latecomer to this, I have to tell you, my conversion to kingdom thinking, and I finally got into the kingdom was Jesus' obsession. I mean that in a positive way. He talked about, by the way, he mentioned church once, and it's when he created it, but he talked about the kingdom every day. There are over 90 references in the Gospels where he talks about the kingdom of heaven, kingdom of God, or just kingdom. And it seems to me, I've become convinced that Jesus was far more concerned with getting heaven to earth than getting us earthlings to heaven. And that's why he, taught us to pray. And that's why you're picking up on, people are having a tough time right now. I mean, what are we thinking about doing? I mean, we should be improving their lives right now.
So was there a moment where you kind of, went, this clarity kind of hit you that we need to be living Christ and loving and blessing people out there rather than trying to attract and market whatever is happening in here?
I don't know that there was a moment. It has been more of a journey.
Okay.
If that would encourage your listeners. But I would say the closest thing to the moment was what started. Well, I remember as a pastor for 11 years, I was a church planter and started a church and was there. And then I left to go to a denominational post. And I remember I had just spoken to a group of pastors driven across the state. I'd got home about 11:30 at night, pulled into this, and we were living in an apartment at the time, a very different environment, a multi-ethnic, it's just a very different environment from the single home community that I'd, had left as a pastor. And so I pull in and I'm turn off the car engine. And I suddenly, it just hits me, that I worked 10 years, 11 years, building the perfect church, and nobody in this apartment complex would walk across the street to attend it. And it's almost as if the Spirit just punctured at that moment. And it was a very disconcerting thought, because I just thought, have I just thrown my life away those 11 years? Well, I've come to put it in perspective now. Certainly not. But that started for me a journey that led me to figure out, well, how does what we do here, how could that connect with folks here in this apartment complex, that are not church people? In fact, we're not going to turn them into church people in order for them to hear the gospel. I mean, that was my tribe's basic thing, is if you'll just get people to come to church, we'll take care of it from there. I mean, that's crazy. I mean, that's crazy thinking.
As I'm listening to you, I remembered a quote that's very sad, but I think important, from a Lutheran pastor back in 1951. He wrote this book, and he quoted another pastor, and he says this: "We have done again what the Reformation sought to undo.
Wow.
We've professionalized religion. We have turned witness bearing into a class prerogative and pay some man a salary to do it for us while we come to church and listen."
Wow. Man. And I mean, what a prescient cut right to it. I mean, other folks, I mean, church as institution has become a vendor of religious goods and services, just like we come there and we sit to get our worship pez, our sermon pez, our youth ministry pez, and we've just turned people into religious consumers, and not exactly viral kingdom agents.
So how do we make that shift? Because it's not just kind of tinkering around at the edges and getting a band, or trying to get a youth pastor who's going to kind of fix everything. I mean, it's not about magic bullets. It goes deeper, and it's a shift. What are some keys there? Help us.
Well, I think I think there are three. When I work with my clients, we look at the following three things. It's nothing less than a church. We have to shift the whole culture of the church. I mean, it can't just be the fall program, or, like you say, some tweak of music offering. I mean, how absurd. But we have to look at the story that we are telling, which is the narrative that we're living out. And are we selling people a great church? Well, that to me is like getting, I mean, God, that's only getting them halfway, or not even that far. I mean, people having a relationship with the church is not the point. having a relationship with Jesus is the point. But I'm afraid that we've given far too many people the idea, they can think about their relationship to the church because it's like a club membership. But, you start talking about a relationship with Jesus and they kind of look at you a little squinty eyed. Like, I'm not sure what you're talking about. And so our story. So what story are we telling? Is it a kingdom story? Is it a church-centric story? The second thing, and I alliterate this for my clients so they can remember, and plus I'm, was taught to preach this way. We have to look at the scorecard. I mean, the scorecard that we have now, of course, is very church-centric, and it reinforces exactly. I mean, we're getting exactly what we're built to do here. So we measure, how many folks and how much money do they bring, how often do they show up. And so it's church programming stats developed by church people for church people consumption on church property. On and on and on. I mean, how silly is this when we're given the Great Commission, which is to, impact the whole world. And we still think that the kingdom of God can be shrink wrapped down to what happens on our place on Sunday. I mean, gosh, Sunday's God's day off. I don't know why we think that's the, maybe he can take the day off because we have it covered. But so the story and the scorecard and then the stewardship, those three things. So what do we think we're responsible for? If we think it's only this group of believers, followers, folks who say we belong to this church, this congregation, that's a pretty that's not the ecclesia that Jesus referred to when he established the church, because the ecclesia in his day had responsibility for the community. It's a group of elders and so I mean that would be silly for the ecclesia of a community to say, our community is going to hell in a handbasket, but we're having great meetings with the ecclesia. I mean, you should have heard. I mean, the music's fab. It's just so crazy. So those three things are essential, and you don't get a pass on any. You got to do all three. Now, there is a fourth element, but I always introduce it last and much later and that is the structure.
Okay.
The reason I don't bring it up at first, though, is, people want to go to work on the structure right away. And this is it's a way to get killed as a leader. I mean, you're messing with you have to mess with the why. You have to figure out what the mission is first, and then the structure reflects that. You go to work on the structure without thinking through these other things, you're going to get nowhere.
Yeah.
So those are critical shifts that we have to make.
One thing that I run into amongst my tribe or churches and pastors who are just a little bit flummoxed, maybe a little bit discouraged because they say, well, we send a mission team to Guatemala. We support the food pantry. We might do, one or two other little things in the community. And I don't know if we can do anything more missional, but it hasn't changed anything.
Yeah.
What's going on there with that thinking and kind of help us out there?
Well, it's that thinking reflects church programming modality again, that it's our job to program people's missional existence on the planet, so we tell them just come here and do these things we figured out for you, and you can check your box off and you go and bash your rat killing and claim to be mission. I mean, it's an extension of thinking that is so church-centric, as opposed to a scorecard that says, our job is not to create programs. Our job is and to develop programs. I mean, most people said yes to ministry thinking they were going to impact people. So, and then you wind up realizing you're in the sermon production business and you're in the church program design and implementation business. And dealing with people is kind of like dealing with moon rocks. You can't quite get to it. You're always dealing with some intermediary something, hoping that it's somehow impacting people. Well, we've got to throw off all this intermediate stuff and realize that people are built to last, and our job is to develop people, period. And that's what Jesus did. I mean, he developed people. He developed disciples. In fact, I don't even use the word discipleship anymore because people confuse that, and then they start thinking about curriculum and all this stuff that we do at church. No, it's what is it? How do you develop people? That should be the preeminent question that every church leader noodles.
Yeah. Wow. Especially for Lutherans who should understand this idea of the priesthood of all believers.
Oh, gosh, yes. I mean, would you folks just turn loose of that so somebody can go do something with it? I mean, y'all own that. No, but you're exactly right. I mean, it is like the great untried doctrine of the Reformation, I mean, but it's central. Exodus 19, 1 Peter 2, 5 and 9, Revelation 4. I mean, it's a central theme and it does make sense if you realize that the kingdom is about life and about people growing into their own skin, into the dream that God has for who they are. I mean, it's a compelling story that if we would tell it, people would find completely interesting, as opposed to the story we're telling of come join us in religious activity. It's going to make a difference. Are you kidding? No wonder we can't intersect people's lives, I mean.
And it's no wonder that pastors get discouraged.
Yes.
And beat up and burn out. But if you see people's lives being transformed and you see members touching other people's lives and they get jazzed about it, and then you see other people.
You're exactly right.
I can't wait to get to work the next day.
That's it. And to tell those stories and to hear those stories is a primary engine for gathering times. To encourage us all. And so maybe we've had a rough time, but you hear that Mary's had this wonderful, and I mean, it just does something for you, and it doesn't get old. I mean, this is why storytelling is every commercial is a story, 15 seconds, or whatever. I mean, people are drawn to that. And, but when they come to a church experience that is devoid of that kind of transformational juice, and there's no compelling story to it, to shuffle forward to receive elements or whatever. I mean, no, goodness gracious. I mean, religion. This is why God hates religion. I mean, because it gives people a substitute for the vitality that He wants them to actually experience.
Yeah.
Which is life.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other thing us pastors have got to realize is, with the fourth human information revolution, the digital revolution, increasingly people in our culture, millennials and Gen Zs or iGens, whatever you call them, and everyone younger than that can't remember a time where you had to go to a bank or a movie theater to see a movie, or a pizza place to get a pizza, or a library to get a book, or a bookstore. I mean, look how, or a retail mall to look how antiquated, and yet we still think they need to come to church to get God, and we can't figure out why they see that as and it has to be it's on Sunday and it's at certain times. I mean, how antiquated, not even antiquated, that's beyond it. It doesn't even make sense to them.
Yeah.
But if we think church programming is our scorecard, then we're all the time trying to figure out how to get people involved on our schedule and our stuff. But if we believe that developing people is our deal, we can celebrate that all week long.
Yeah.
Because that's exactly how it works.
And that's the end of the first part of our interview with Reggie McNeal. In the second part, he talks about people development for kingdom-centered ministry and how that can happen. And if he gives a number of examples about people development from his travels around the United States and the world. And if you'd like to learn more, you can go to reggiemcneal.org. But the truth is that transformation for ourselves probably doesn't happen just through a podcast or a book, but is step-by-step working with someone. So reach out to Reggie McNeal or contact us for personal coaching for yourself, for your teams, or for your congregation. You can go to scottgress.com or email me at scottgress@me.com. So stay tuned for part 2, and God bless you in your leadership development, and we look forward to seeing you next time on The Coaching Leader.